say your names and let us know where we are.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Well, first.
My name's Rachel Falcone, and we're in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn.
My name is Michael Premo, and we're in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn.
Cool. So, tell me a little bit how the two of you come together as artists.
So Mike and I met in, when was it, 2008, 2007. We were both working with, sort of found each other at this oral history project called StoryCorps. It's a national oral history project. And actually had the opportunity to collaborate with lots of different artists that they brought on, different kinds of folks that were sort of from different mediums that were coming to help facilitate interviews. The StoryCorps does thousands of interviews every year, inviting people to share stories, just everyday people to share stories with each other, and folks often bring a loved one to come and either interview them or be interviewed. And so there's sort of this privileged role of getting to be the witness to those stories. And so Mike and I met in that opportunity of just, being one of the folks that was getting to listen to so many stories. And we both traveled around the country. Mike spent a lot of time in the South as part of the Griot initiative. And then I was actually out west, so sort of like the American West, and seeing different Utah and New Mexico. And so we had the opportunity to sort of work together and collaborate, and then sort of came together with our first project, which was Housing as a Human Right. And
yeah, I think we really connected around, so StoryCorps, the way it works is just regular folks can come in and share their story, but also they had these special initiatives. One was with, as she mentioned, the Griot Project, which is with the Smithsonian, and they had a memory loss project, which was people who were self-diagnosed as having Alzheimer's, and there was the 9/11 Project, and there was a bunch of these sort of special initiatives, and we felt that no matter what the initiative was or where we were in the country, when people were sort of like privileged with what they felt was privileged with the opportunity to share their story for posterity, what they were talking about is home. And no matter what they would say or how they would say it, they could never once ever mention the word home, but like their interaction, their conversation was about home, and like leaving a piece of their home and a piece of their existence for posterity, right? So we just started kind of rapping on this idea of what home is and what home means. And we were also sort of both activists, organized as well as community organizing, and we're interested in this idea of human rights and this idea of housing. But often, because of the nature of housing, the nature of home, often it's only people that are in precarious situations of housing or home that are the most sort of ready to talk about it in a weird kind of way. You don't realize what you got till it's gone, right?
Right.
And so we wanted to like have a project that would, or have a creative intervention or interrogation around this nature of home through this project dealing with housing and what human rights looks like.
Right.
Which now has evolved to sort of like trying to address this key question about sort of how do we unite diverse communities around the issues of housing, land, and the dignity of a place to call home.
Right.
And that's how we met.
And so how do you do that? What are the methodologies that you're implementing and exploring these ideas?
I mean, I think we started the project, right, so in like, it was 08 or 09 when we just started doing a bunch of interviews. And really it was organic. We met partners on the street where we would go to a rally or a protest, and we met some great partners that then we collaborated with for years. And just had the opportunity to listen to people that were struggling. We had the opportunity with the Laundromat Project to sort of share an initial group of stories in our first exhibit. And so we did about 30 or so interviews with people that were struggling, and just as a way to really understand what is the landscape of people, and really intentionally wanted to bring in stories of folks that were long time struggling in the crisis with sort of the newer foreclosure stories. And so we collaborated with a variety of groups that kind of represented different aspects of the population. So Picture the Homeless, which is a membership-led group of folks that are homeless. And among their members was stories of folks that had dealt with addiction, but also foreclosure, a variety of stories just within their organization.
Right.
And then we also collaborated with Fury in Brooklyn, and stories of their members that have been one that was a store owner and had lost her business due to sort of development, and that story of development coming in and taking away sort of her livelihood
Mm-hmm.
and her business and her ability to then purchase a home herself.
Mm.
And so just saw that landscape of sort of the diversity of stories that exist around home, and just how interesting it was to open up that question of what home means to different people
Right.
in different stages of their life, different, race and class and economic situations. And so I think a lot of the project is driven by sort of that compulsion to listen to folks,
Uh-huh.
and really sort of hear where they're at, and then use stories to create shared understanding.
Mm.
So Mike and I really privilege our process as much as our product, sort of like the opportunity to distribute and share the stories,
Right.
which is a whole nother, process of engagement, but really sort of like, at least for me, the first step, and what I sort of, what draws me to this work is really just the opportunity to sit like this in someone's kitchen and just hear what's going on for them, and how they've come to think about home, like through their movement through their life.
Yeah.
And the part of like the aspiration of the mythology, something we're not there yet, but it's the dream, is
Yes.
to like really evolve out of transactional relationships with our community, with neighbors, and try to like figure out how we can form a more at least aspirational, transformational relationships between participatory, what's often called like sort of academic world, like participatory research processes.
Yeah.
And so our practice is about participation and engagement, and the sort of just the blessing of the generosity of people, blessing us with the opportunity for them to tell us their stories, right? And just being humbled by that blessing, and being able to like figure out how we can make that not just a transaction where you're just giving me your story and then I'm going to put it on our wall, but what does that mean to have that be more of a transformational, at least in aspiration, in terms of like how we bridge that relationship, so that, because communities are so used to that sort of transaction, or someone writing a book, or someone taking a photo, or you're taking photos of our kids playing in hydrants, and then you're putting them on a gallery wall in Soho, and I get nothing, and I'm still here, ass out, or I don't know if I can, sorry.
No,
but
you can say,
ass out,
Sure.
and it's like, how do we build from that? Because I think the art I think there's a responsibility. It's complicated, right? Like the art itself has value that is beyond the sort of form, and often communities don't recognize that art. It's not always there. It's not as though, and it's like our space and our process to figure out how we can sort of find that marriage of those two, both community and the practice as well as the process,
Right.
and be able to develop those long-term relationships.
Yeah, definitely. So how have you been thinking about, that approach? I mean, what models have you been looking at? I mean, just sort of thinking about this iteration where you are now, about, this gathering, collecting of information and coming into people's homes and listening to them and privileging that experience, right? But what other sorts of methodologies or approaches are you thinking about in terms of, what the next phases are?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's funny. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a longtime ensemble theater maker, making theater collaboratively, who's offered to help do a what should you call it? It's like a lineage tree of like all your influences, because like we're in a space where we're at a regenerative space,
Right.
and we're trying to like piece together all our influences have obviously become like this, and then we're in this space where we're trying to figure out sort of like aesthetically how we move forward,
Right.
and part of that is going back to reassess our roots, So I
Definitely.
think participatory research is a huge part of that. My background is in theater and collaborative art making, collaborative storytelling through a sort of like performative context.
Right.
So in that are like shards of sort of Augustus Boal, and sort of like how sort of like that he and his children and subsequent companies around the world sort of use these like guiding questions to like interrogate a specific issue in a way that was solely generated by the community, and then the response would be based on what the community wanted, and the piece would be devised that way.
Right.
I created a piece sort of in that tradition, as well as what's called there's this woman named Dorothy Heathcott from London, from England, Manchester, I think, who is sort of like a famous practitioner of this style of theater called theater and education, which is a participatory practice. And so I was blessed to be in South Africa for a study abroad that I extended. you know, because I fell in love with that complicated place.
Yeah.
Where we did all these interviews with people dealing with HIV, and the piece was called Living with HIV. And so we did all these interviews with people, and this is the TIE method, the Theater and Education Heathcote method, where we did all these interviews with folks and found that through those interviews, everyone was talking about contraception, right? And folks in the slums, the communities were like, well, AIDS is an acronym for American Invention to Destroy Sex. And so that was a whole other complication around like what contraception meant.
Right.
And then people were just talking about sort of like the controversy around whether or not it exists. But nobody in our interviews, it came out, was talking about what do you do when you have it? Will you just die immediately? What happens?
Right.
So through those processes of interviews, that guided the process of the project, and we decided, and I was the only all the other members were South African, we're all from black and what they call colored slums in South Africa. And so we decided to create this piece that was based on those interviews. It was called Living with HIV, and it was a high school sort of drama where this kid in school gets HIV through a blood transfusion after being stabbed, and they had the school council, which is the audience, has to decide what to do with it, right? And so like that particular process is like a key part of my mythology and what is part of our methodology, and that sort of like participatory nature of like trying to respond to the community through listening,
right,
and trying to figure out where our project fits and what we call a movement ecology,
right.
And so just trying to look at the landscape and see what our particular skills and what our particular processes might fit in that sort of giant puzzle.
Yeah. What is a movement ecology?
A movement ecology, I think a movement ecology is first of all an ecology of social movements, which is a sort of what I consider to be the positive progression and evolution of history. Revolution is not a singular moment. Revolution is evolution. And revolutionary moments, like the particular one that we found ourselves since Benghazi, since the Tunisian revolution began, or uprising as they call it, they don't call it a revolution, are just sort of like growth spurts in our evolution, right? In the march of history, right? And technology and all of the so-called quote-unquote progress that we've been around isn't matched by our sort of intellectual and by our emotional and spiritual evolution, right? And so a movement ecology is all those little pieces in that process that are propelling history and humanity forward, really. And the ecology is like a healthy environment that nourishes the healthy evolution of mankind, of humanity, really, right? And so very often, because we live in a sort of Western society, and Western thinking is to compartmentalize things and categorizes and feels the need to quantify things, removing things from their place of balance within the harmony of an ecology, right? And that approach, the sort of looking at things as a movement ecology, attempts to place things in their spheres of balance.
Right.
So we all know the role that we play in this sort of like march of history and the march of evolution of humanity.
Yeah, and I would just add, like, we were talking even just to someone about Occupy, recently, and all just the recent movements, and people are like, well, it has done, it definitely hasn't fixed everything, like maybe it's helped a little bit, but it hasn't fixed everything, and just like trying to explain to folks that like every part of a movement or every aspect of the role of an artist is not to solve everything. It's sort of to play this role, the specific role, and to understand that everyone else has to play their role for actually change to happen. At least that's, yeah. And
in that, I think, we've begun to perceive and believe very firmly that artists are the midwives of revolution. It's artists who sort of like birth these new possibilities into being, and help give birth to the possibilities of liberation through that sort of movement.
Yeah.
I firmly believe that.
Yeah. I want to talk about roles a little bit, because I think that's an interesting concept in relation to a project like this. How do you define roles? How do you determine roles? And then how do you build in flexibility for roles to shift?
Do you mean the role of us in the larger movement, or the role within the work?
Well, within your work, I think if we start with just thinking about how you define roles within your work, and I think that has everything to do with, calling yourselves artists, and then your relationship to audience, and then the role of the audience and the role of the community. How do you determine what those roles are, and then what those relationships are among the roles?
For sure. I think we often feel like we're wearing a bunch of different hats. I can't speak for you, but yeah, I would say we both agree that we're constantly just, moving from, which is why I think our, the name on our bio is like the identities has shifted over the last several years, just because there's
weeks, days, depending on who we're talking to.
Exactly. And often, like, particularly starting this project, we found very quickly, like, just the challenge of working with community organizations that are membership led and have a specific way of doing things and organizing, and then coming in to collaborate as so-called artists and playing that role. And so realizing the challenges of sort of just even communicating, and how much it is just about explaining sort of what the role of the work could be in their organizing work, and listening to sort of what they're doing and understanding that.
Right.
I think, over the last several years, we've shifted towards more sort of like organizer role, as we've sort of become much more directly involved in some of the organizing work, and actually trying to use the art sort of as an integral part alongside the organizing, so that's happening at the same time, and both are informing each other, and just have the opportunity to collaborate with people that are willing to sort of go on that experiment or adventure with us. And so to me, it's definitely evolving.
Right.
It's something that, and then at moments now that we've been doing a lot of more sort of the role of actual just organizing, is like then shifting back sometimes to feeling like, okay, I want to go back to the role of an artist and feel more in the creative space, and what does that look like? So some of it's for myself, the shift and the sort of need to sort of understand what I'm doing when. We sort of started the project and spent a lot of time just sitting in on meetings and being part of and being invited into the space, the organizing space, to listen and to hear, and sort of then became more of a facilitator, and sort of saying, well, this organization's saying this and this organization's saying this, you guys should talk to each other, and actually trying to help foster communication in the movement. And now sometimes we're invited to meetings just to be there because now we've amassed this much knowledge about where the movement is and who's participating in it, and sort of are able to see the possibilities and sort of the spaces for more imaginative work to happen, and sort of the artistic work to happen. So yeah, that's a lot of what I'm saying is just that we're constantly shifting roles. I don't know if there's any other.
Yeah, man, it's like a dance. Sometimes your toes get stepped on, and that sucks. But the music keeps playing, and you gotta keep on going. Because your roles are always constantly changing.
Right.
Constantly changing. It depends like what the circumstances who we're interacting with. Sometimes we jokingly call ourselves sort of like what do we say? It's something facilitator. What was it? It's like it's kind of like facilitator. Like we're facilitating sort of like this sort of like interaction between different things, whether it's different mediums, or whether it's between forms of expression, or whether it's between communities, or that very often sometimes live next door to each other but aren't talking because of whatever, you know. So a lot of times it's about the role. It's like whatever that is, there's still that role of facilitation that's happening.
Well, do you think that ability, whether it is born of necessity, to have to shift between roles, do you think that speaks to this type of project as transcending being a community organization, where, I mean, it is that, right? But then it is also an art project, and, it takes on these different characteristics of things. And so I'm wondering if that ability to move between roles is a characteristic of what makes it an art project. And what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think I just thought of the word like flexibility. I think that has, and we very much treated the work, not every artist does, but we very much treated our work as a journey. And so we have moved based on where people are at and where we feel like the best need is for the work that we're doing. So we found partners that we feel like our work could really, be useful to their organizing, or that we really admire and we want to work with and collaborate and sort of be influenced by in our work. And so that's allowed us to sort of to shape our work, and that flexibility, which you don't necessarily have if you have a membership that's saying, I need this now, and so there's the need to do like a directed campaign that has specific wins and that is doing this. I think we're able to be more flexible in terms of who we're working with and trying to do, and sort of the impact that we're trying to have, because there is both the tangible impact but also the more intangible impact that we're trying to have, which we know could be, accomplished with a variety of groups or partners or different relationships. I always feel like our work, we could work with probably hundreds of groups around the country, and it would be a different experience, but it's just, there's so much need out there, because there's so many people working on this issue, and a lot of them aren't talking to each other, and so I just feel like there's, endless opportunity to do the work, whereas sometimes when you're working in a specific community, you're locked into that, to that work.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the word I was looking for before is interpretive facilitators, and it's like, it really is that space of being able to like have fluidity moving between these spaces of not not fully being an organization, not being this, not being that, but like being able to move between them and interpret, because a lot of what we find ourselves doing even is translating. Like we're translators, like translating between the art and between the organizations, and sometimes we're with sort of communities of artists and sort of translating the language of like organizing and activists, and sometimes with organizing and activists translating the language of art, and like our practice is very much rooted in that sort of interpretive sort of like creation, right? And that's just our particular sort of like core of our practice, but it is about interpretation and translation really at its core.
How important is it that the communities that you're engaged with know that this is an art project?
Yeah, it's that's interesting. That's an interesting question. It's very important, but like not, how do I say?
I think we're very clear that there's like a limit to how much we can do. What's exciting about the level of the organizing right now is that now I feel like we're in a better space to say like we're connected to people that maybe could help, so if someone wants to fight back and stay in their home, like we actually have more of a capacity to do sort of radical organizing work that we didn't a couple of years ago. When we were sort of saying, okay, the story can take you this far, and the work that we will sit with you and we will listen and we will try to share your story, but there's that limit of like what that can do. But it's a necessary sort of first step. And so I think the language of our project is something that we wrestle with. And just how to explain it, and it has shifted. Like we don't always come into a community and say this is an art project. I think we really are very cognizant of what language makes sense for which community, and because it's not always like necessarily an art project. I mean, it is to a degree, but at some point it's also an organizing project. And so I think articulating it where we think of what we're doing.
Yeah, it's like creativity is at the core, and being able to express somehow that it's creative. It's funny to because we play that grant dance game, that's like we realized, because someone asked us to apply to something, that you could call this stuff transmedia, and I was like, I'd never heard of that.
But that's transmedia is hot now.
Hot now, yeah. And we realized we've been doing that for 10 years. So
it's like,
oh, cool.
Yeah. But it's not actually transmedia, because they have another idea of transmedia.
Yeah,
often a little more digital.
Often transmedia in that world means like a piece of a documentary, and so we don't have a documentary film. They're like, oh, you're not quite transmedia enough.
I see.
So.
Because we're like all the stuff that is transmedia, but we don't have a film. So they're like, who are you?
But I'm just looking, I feel like there is a sort of a filmic element to.
Absolutely. 100%. I mean, it's like that cinematic sort of aspect is core to it. We make videos, we create like short films and multimedia, and that's like speaks to the core challenge of our work. And what we wrestle with and battle with and argue about all the time is sort of like, what is that space? What'll be relevant to this community and that community and all of them at one time? Well, I don't know, But creativity is the core to that, and like expressing that this is a creative project.
Right.
One, for practical ways, we can't solve all your housing problems talking to you.
Right.
But what we can do is creative,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we can open up that space,
Right.
right, for creativity of flow, and that's core to what it is, and that definition of like, because I think, and it's interesting how the project's been recontextualized by circumstances like the Arab Spring and Occupy, where suddenly there's this like renewed appetite for this human rights, this project that talks about human rights, and this project that's like doing stuff in laundromats and vacant storefronts, and we have a show coming up in the fall that'll be in a vacant storefront, and like it's we've realized, we've noticed that the people that have sort of been reaching out to us, that has been expanded greatly
Right.
since the Arab Spring and Occupy.
Right.
And I argue that's part of that, like sort of because Occupy primarily, and also the Arab Spring, but at least in the American context, in a lot of ways, regardless of what you think, and I've been part of that, I have my full share of critiques, but like regardless, on some level, it's kind of opened up this sort of radical creative imagination,
Right.
giving us the permission to sort of dream differently about how change happens, why it happens, what art is. Like, I have this piece coming out that I argue that, is as much a performance project. Like, Occupy was as much a performance project as it was anything else, right?
For sure.
And so, like, that is at the essence of trying to articulate this sort of creative project and, like, trying to, like, hold that container and express in all these different languages that we have to keep, like, translate it into what that creative project means or looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that performance element of Occupy is also what makes it problematic to a large degree, because, I mean, and thinking about what you're saying about the ecology of movement, or movement ecology, protests and, our common understanding of what that is to yield some sort of result, right? It's like, well, what are we protesting for?
Yeah.
And when you were speaking, you were saying that, there's seems like this expectation on behalf of the communities that you work with. They will, are you going to solve something? Is this, how are we going to resolve what it is that we are, this project that we're embarking on? So if you could talk a little bit about, the expectations of people when you are engaged in a creative project that has real life, physical, ramifications for individuals that are involved.
Well, first of all, we don't know Oprah. It's been asked. Apparently, because we interviewed people, they were like, "Oh, you're gonna get this." We were in South Africa, and they wanted us to get us on Oprah. Get them this recording to Oprah.
Okay.
And I had,
you don't know Oprah. That's
like,
I
don't know Oprah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd like to know Oprah. I'm sure she's a nice lady, but I don't know Oprah. So that's expectation.
$1 million.
I can't pay you for your story.
Right.
I'm not gonna make $1 million off your story.
Right.
Those are like real, like, expectations that we deal with managing from folks, who have a certain expectation of what art is.
Right.
Because all artists are millionaires.
Oh.
Right?
Oh,
You know what I'm saying?
People
Like,
think that?
even though they don't want their children
Where
to
do
be in
people think
art,
this?
they don't want your children to be an artist,
Ah.
but artists are millionaires.
Yeah.
I don't know how that works
I would
out
say
fully.
it's more the fringe, but yeah, they exist. They exist out
I'm being a
there.
little cynical, maybe.
No, totally. I
I'm
think
on camera.
I think people are really generous though, like to say the opposite. Like I think most people, like 95% are generous and just kind of like,
Yeah, easily.
are just interested, want to know up front, like, how are you gonna both ask me, we're just very clear that we're not coming in as journalists. So we're not gonna just come in and just ask these questions, and we always are creating space, and the interview will sit as long as you want. Usually people kind of melt after like 4 hours, but
That's not the
Oh,
transaction.
my
that's
gosh.
moving beyond the transaction piece.
yeah.
Okay.
So the opportunity to just, sit with people as long as they want, to come back another time, to always ask, is there anything else you want to share, to sort of just create the space for them to share. We don't try to grill people, like if there's things that they don't want to talk about, then they don't have to talk about them. I think it's just really an opportunity for them to share what they want to share, and just get beyond kind of like their own like legend and memory and their own, just actually open up space for
Right.
people to get beyond their like spiel or whatever they're putting up as their wall,
Right.
and actually just create a space for like them to let that down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people are generous. I mean, they share things that like they tell us they haven't shared with their kids, because often there's just so much shame around the housing crisis, particularly around foreclosure, that
Right.
folks don't want to share with their family, and so they're letting us into that and some of those memories and some of that experience. And so the expectation is that we're just very clear, like we won't share your story without sharing it back with you, and we will there's no interest in sort of just spreading it around something that you're not willing to have out there. And that was something that coming from the work that we did, we really wanted to be clear with people that will share it, but also there's like a certain life of the project where we'll tell people, hey, it's going to be at this exhibit, it's going to be here, and then at a certain point it's like, I don't need to call you for it 4 years down the line, but
Right.
We're trying, at least still with our small capacity, to continue relationships with some of the people we've interviewed. Sometimes people have kind of fallen off the radar, both for us and then for the organizations we've partnered with. So
It's just the nature of folks,
Right. Oh, for sure.
and just the expectation that we're trying to share this in as many venues as possible. So this may be shared at a meeting, this may be shared here, but that your voice is powerful and it has the possibility for other people to connect to it. I think we just try to be really clear and answer questions for people, and also just say that I can't help you get a lawyer, I can't help you do this, I can connect you to as many people as we know,
Right.
but we're not, housing is a human right, although it sounds like a service organization, is not one, and so we're not able to do more than that. I think what's exciting is to know that if I wanted to help defend someone in their home, I might have a couple hundred people that are crazy enough to come and help me defend another neighbor, and
Right.
so we're in that moment right now, which
Right.
we weren't a couple of years ago. So that's a little bit more exciting to feel like I can say to people, if you have the fire to fight, there might be people that will do that with you,
Right.
and we can help connect that. So that's exciting, but there's definitely limits to our capacity, as artists and as people.
Yeah.
As two people
Yeah.
with no funding. So there's just a limit to what we can do with people.
But everyone had people. The thing that people I think most often underestimate, especially about themselves, is just the power of storytelling and the power of listening. I think the greatest skill of an interviewer, a good interviewer, is just listening, right? And I think people don't expect to be able I don't want to say it's an honor because that's a little bit too much, but people just often don't expect the results of sitting and being having someone honor their experience by listening to them for as long as they'll talk.
For sure.
And by the end of it, people just have a really interesting and beautiful response to just that power of all right, you have something to share.
Oh,
Even if it's
definitely.
that fleeting moment, it's not changing your situation at all perhaps, but in your heart it slightly is, and I think that's beautiful.
Well,
really beautiful to see.
I think of it as an indulgence, because I think that we live in such a time where you don't have those opportunities to really indulge in conversation, really, to indulge in listening. It's really this sort of a privilege, if you will, just to kind of, but a really kind of mundane privilege, and you realize the lack of it, the lack of it being built in just in terms of the way that we relate to each other, societally. And so many of our relationships are transactional. Anybody who's ever applied for food stamps and had to sit in that god-awful office and That's
be
right.
humiliated by those, I'm sure they're nice people at home, but in that office it's crazy.
That's right.
Right? And so when you can have a moment where you can actually talk to someone and someone's actually genuinely interested and listening and feeling honored by the legend that you construct for yourself, because we all have these personal legends. And so
right.
if you can share that legend, that's tremendous,
Yeah, I think
And
so.
knowing that we're people, and so it's interesting to just see how people respond differently to either as I'm a white woman and Michael is a man, as a man of color. So it's just it's interesting also what the meaning is, if their kids happen to be there, if they're not, it changes how people talk,
Absolutely.
And so that's just interesting is how do we create the best space for people to share? How do we just create that space for people?
What do you ask people?
What do we ask people?
Mm-hmm.
The only regular, the only question that we ask everyone is, what does home mean to you? And then I guess we ask less, what is human rights?
mean to you?
Mean to you. We ask that, but like we ask that even less. The only thing we always definitely ask is, what does home mean to you? But for us, interviewing is just like, usually we start with like their early life. Or if it's someone who's used to talking a lot, we sort of like just let them talk and wear out their spiel, you know, and after those 10 to 20 minutes and they're done with their spiel, then we kind of ask about their early life, and it's just about looking for that spark and just fanning that flame of interest and curiosity within themselves.
Right.
And those stories come out.
Yeah. And sometimes they don't, and it's like just understanding that, you know, like what, maybe that's where that person is at, maybe they just don't want to share, maybe they're not a storyteller, maybe they're just like, you know, and this is what they're going to share, and this is how they talk. So it's just like, you know, it's a matter, but surprisingly most people have that, you know, are storytellers, even though they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves storytellers.
And finding that way in, you know, obviously we're two different people who, we reconstruct our own memories very differently, you know, and every individual, and there's probably like, someday maybe we'll write a book about this, but I'm convinced there's like 6, and I'm sure someone way smarter than me has like real information about this, but like anecdotally, there's like, seems to be like 5, 6 different sort of like general ways that people like remember things, right? That we've just kind of observed. And I don't remember, we batted about back and forth like what they are, but like, like some people are like emotion, like it's 2 broad categories where it's sort of like intellectual, sort of people who are like heady and like they remember like dates or like things or like objects, and other people are like emotionally, they'll remember like how they felt at that time, and they'll remember what this feeling was like. And the other people are like, oh, I remember that the sky was blue or there was cloudy, and the other person doesn't even remember anything except how that person made them feel, right? And so, you know, being able to just like see how they reconstruct their memories and how they remember memory, and like that guides the questions.
What have you learned about, you know, by asking that question, by putting the question of what does home mean to you? What have you learned about people's conceptions of community by asking that question?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, community is the answer to that. And it's really, actually, lately, it's just been on our mind in terms of talking about other people, like how do we actually really use this project to connect people, and home and sort of as like one word that really is subjective for people, and so then like very much allows that space for people to share what that means has kind of been of a word. It's a word that I think is going to be like a main thing in our new exhibit that's coming up, and just and really sort of trying to articulate for people, like finding out from people what that means for people. I mean, I think depending on their experience, whether or not they're in a rural situation or urban or suburban, it's like that in some ways determines a little bit what they think of as home.
Right.
And how, like, you know, an urban community, like at least being here now as an adult in New York City, is just very different than the way I conceived of community when I was growing up in the suburbs. So I just feel like it varies for people and where they're at emotionally at that moment, you know, like whether or not they're thinking about there's very specific, tangible 4 walls of their apartment, or they're thinking more in terms of relationships, and like my home is my daughter because she's like 4 years old and she's with me right now, and so I'm really thinking about her, and that's on my mind. Or my home is a place where I can be barefoot and, you know, take off my clothes in the hot summer, you know. It's just like depends on where they're at in their life journey, I think.
Yeah, and again, I think it breaks down to how people sort of like those memories, but it's the more times we ask that question, the more the answers become even more and more similar. You know, like we've kind of anecdotally kind of shifted out of pool, it seems, and you know, home is community, as she said.
Right.
And community is often expressed, and like I group family into that as well. Like people will say, what does home is? Well, you know, home is my daughter, home is my husband, my wife, my whatever, closest loved one.
Right.
And then there's a group of folks that like do it on sort of like security, stability, warmth, you know, and saying, well, a home is a community that's stable, or a community that's warm, or, you know, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think, those are like the big ones that, you know, are almost ubiquitous. And this is across color, class, and community. We were in Philly last year with a show with folks who were or a variety of different sort of Chinese ethnicities, South Asian initiative like Laotian and Cambodian, and we did this project in South Africa. We were down there, and the answers were still the same. There was still this thing, family, still about stability, security. In South Africa they call it security of tenure. Which is being able to know that you're all going to be here for as long as you see fit.
Yeah. So here we are within this context of socially engaged art practice. And a major part, as I was explaining to you earlier, of being involved in this and, me speaking to you and us having this moment is attempting to define what social engagement means. And for me, I've just kind of boiled it down to the key component is that there has to be people involved in some way. The people have to be integral to the process, whether it be a part of the art making or the creativity or how you evaluate the success of the creative endeavor, that people have to be involved at every level in the making or process of something. And so I'm just curious to hear, first of all, what you think about this idea of socially engaged art practice. And, is it important to create these kinds of parameters and categories?
I mean, I just throw out, and then maybe you can put your more articulate spin on it. But I think it's fun. It's just like, talking to an artist the other day who does more solo stuff, like in a studio, and like talks about how important the exhibition is for him because it's like he gets to come out and be with the community, and for us, like I don't necessarily think in those binary terms, just because like our whole process is to be with people and in the community, and we're never really just like alone. Perhaps when we're like editing the stories is the only time when, but I actually despise that. Like I hate having to put on the headphones and just like totally get in there and like just be away from the world and do that. I mean, although it's part of the process, it's
right.
Because it's the only time actually that we're not just like with people engaging and bouncing ideas off of them, and so for me it's just kind of like the way that I would want to do it. Always. I don't know. Just it's fun.
Yeah, it's mad fun. Yeah, and it's funny. It's one of those words that like it didn't realize there was a word for what we did before. We finally discovered that word. And,
oh yeah.
And it was like early on when I was sort of like just kind of coming up and wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. But I think it's just fun to work with folks. And I think for me coming like theater is the sort of like creative medium that really like got me open initially, and it's collaborative.
Right.
And like I like making art collaboratively, and I think when you look at like the ecology of the world, everything is done, nothing is done in isolation, nothing can happen, and most importantly, like the creation of more life can never happen, like except for a few, there are organisms that do that, of course, but like, to create life, you need other people.
Yeah.
And art is creating life, and our art is about sort of like further enriching the further creation of life in a lot of ways, And so the engagement is necessary because it's about a communication, like I said, our sort of interpretive creation process.
Right.
It's about conversation and communication and participation from the community.
Right. So then where do you locate the art in something like that? Because now you've sort of opened it up to this systemic way of working. So it's not necessarily about any particular thing, although things come out of it. So where is the art then?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if now it makes sense to. I mean, we've been starting, at least me, because I'm like a conceptual person, been starting to think about the role of it in different, like what can be the role, like that's kind of how I'm taking your question, and just sort of, like what can we do in this huge landscape of, where there's needed change around home and housing, and like the little bit that I see that we can do is to like, create the space to sort of, for people to share and to connect those stories. So a lot of the media coverage doesn't really have the space, even if a journalist wanted to, doesn't have the space to talk really about how the long time struggle, occasionally those stories of oh yeah, public housing existed, and is crumbling, will come in, but it's the long time struggle doesn't usually get to be connected, and so we have that opportunity to sort of share this other analysis, and to document these growing movements that sort of are now everywhere and aren't getting enough visibility, or actually sort of real documentation of them. And so sort of that I see as a role that we kind of play. And something we haven't really figured out, which I would love for our work to do, is to actually sort of create space for visioning around a new type of home and housing. And I think a lot of the work that is laying the groundwork for that, but still just creating concrete ways for people to vision, I think is the biggest challenge of the movements right now is that they never have space for visioning because we're constantly responding to the crisis. And so sort of I think where we want to take the work is to be part of that visioning for people, and to actually open up. I mean, it's one of the reasons we went to South Africa in 2010 because they have some of the most beautiful laws around the human right to housing. They're not doing a tremendous job of implementing them, but it's
to say the least.
But to say the least, with a slum population that's doubling. But what's interesting is that they actually have envisioned another society, or started to, in a way that we haven't yet in the U.S. Around housing. So I don't know. That's at least where I see somewhat of the small role that our work can have in that larger movement ecology.
Oh, definitely. I mean, especially as creatives, I think that visioning is where I could see a particular emphasis and a particular usefulness as artists. To start to be engaged in what it might look like.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's
100%.
if we had the power to actually create a different world, what would it look like?
Right.
And that's why we need the artists, that's the role of the artist in this sort of social evolution, because I think, all of this is the art. It's the question is of where it's placed, it's all of the art, right? And then thinking about sort of the need for creativity in this moment is just immense, because, the way art is being expressed, the way the art process is undergoing, as well as sort of in terms of organizing and activism. Our methods and methodology of community organizing are largely based on tactics that were evolved in an industrial society, in industrial workplaces. So now in a post-industrial society, what does it look like to organize people? Right? When these sort of social networks and social media and all of these things are laying bare sort of ancient principles. It's not new. These are ancient principles of how societies want to be organized, but 200 years of industrialization and sort of hierarchical sort of repositioning of social organization kind of realigned us. The sort of natural ancient principles are sort of re-emerging. There's this strain of complex science called emergence that sort of looks at why do all of these things suddenly sort of bubble up to the surface. For example, there's a firefly that all of the fireflies light up at the same time. Scientists have no idea why, but what they call it is emergence. And I think this sort of social upheaval and social change that we've witnessed in the last year, and what they call the latest wave of social movements, is really emphasis of this sort of emergence, of a bubbling up, or what I call a growth spurt of our humanity's evolution. Right? And we need an immense amount of creativity to really understand that, to really analyze, to really look at that, our future is in these sort of principles of emergence and network theory, where we're just allowed to create these hubs, where we're connected to each other and sort of reorganizing society in a decentralized kind of way. And that's the role of creativity. That's art. It's going to be able to look at that and be able to push against these dominant mythologies that we're sort of wrapped in and tied to be able to push us beyond those mythologies into a new reality.
Oh yeah, and you're describing a way of working for artists that isn't, a typical way of working. To make an artist useful. Just think about art and usefulness already. Are these two kind of, they don't really go together. It's you don't really use art. Then it's not art if it's useful. But to conceive of ways of making art and artists useful to the building of civilization, of societies, is revolutionary in and of itself, particularly in the United States. Other places maybe things are different because the support of artists functions in a different way. But particularly in this country, I think that is a completely revolutionary idea in the way in which you're also inviting communities to be a part of that conversation and implicating them as art makers and creatives as well, and being able to to vision, what does housing look like for you? How would you visualize community? It seems to me an extremely powerful medium to mobilize people politically. And I wonder if your audience is conscious of that potential at all, or if you have ever recognized moments of that epiphany where it's like, oh, well, if I could envision my home or community, this is what it would look like.
It's funny you say that, because we before we got sidetracked by the sort of stuff that happened last fall, we were rethinking how aesthetically and process-wise will be the next phase of the project. And we've broken it into 3 broad categories that we're sort of like wrestling with what that means in practice. But intellectually, it's the crisis, movement, and vision. And vision, we're going back and forth between vision and dreaming, and like figuring out how through these stories we can sort of represent and explore all of these. Because it's even the word human rights, I think, is a good example that sort of answers this, right? Where it's like people in community, people who are so-called directly affected, embrace with an open heart this idea of human rights. Like they see it, they feel it, they know what it means. And they don't worry about like, oh, well, the UN and America might use this for like blah, blah, blah over here. It's like, no, man, like human rights are like what I deserve because I'm a person.
Right.
Right? Like there's this quote from someone we interviewed, Lorenzo Diggs, giving me that house, you made me feel like a human being, and that's that human right, to feel human.
Yes.
This is Kat, bless his soul, is locked up again, but has been institutionalized his whole life, and that sentence alone, that's it right there, right? And people know it and they feel it, right? So it's just about creating for us, and where we want to take this, I guess, in our conversations. Figuring out how we can help folks vision, how we can help, like, just create the space. That's not the wrong way to say help people vision, but like create the space for people to vision,
right? Because
people are so often lack just the space.
Cut off from that.
Yeah, right. It's like, no. There are smarter people that got all these degrees from these fancy Ivy buildings. Like, they'll let you know how it is. It's okay. It's like, but nah, man, like, people know what they want. They know what it is, And so, you don't need several degrees to know. And so, yeah, I think that visioning piece is so key to it. And even, like, it comes up, when people talk about, when we ask that question about home is, and
There was a woman, when you asked that, I thought of this woman that we interviewed, and she had like mold. A lot of folks have like black mold in their apartment, and it actually was just like really, creating a bad situation for her kids and whatever. But it's like a small thing in her house. Comparatively, like she has electricity, she has water, whatever.
Right.
But she has black mold. But like, so we talked to her, and we explained the project at the beginning, and then we kind of like then wanted to spend more time with her at the end and really explain like this is how we might share it and blah blah blah. And then she was like, human rights, and she was just like, yeah, I have a human right to like not live with mold, and like this is actually like something that is beyond me,
yes,
and beyond my like very specific circumstance. But like there are people all over the world that are dealing with whatever they're dealing with, and I'm actually connected to them, and like this is my right. And that was like at least one moment that it was just really powerful for me to like know that. And why we've kind of continued against, all the other better judgment to keep our title as like housing is a human right, as this like very kind of like this frame, and to say that, we're not going to just call it home or exploring home or just call it something like really kind of indirect, but we're actually going to create a frame in the project and sort of bring people into that frame and help them see themselves as in part of something bigger.
Yeah, and that's that vision, seeing themselves as something bigger. And human rights is something that's completely obscured in American society. And it was like a greatest example of this, well, not greatest, but the best example, and it's very simple and direct, is we had a post on the Huffington Post about some of the works, and the comments, people were pissed.
Well,
like they were
what
personally
was the
offended
post?
that we were using. It was just it was a story
About
our work.
Oh.
And the comment sections were like took it personally that we put the word housing and human rights in the same sentence. Like personally, people were personally like livid. I can't even describe like the hate you could see from the comments where people were offended that because we don't need to deal with human rights in America because we have laws and blah blah blah, right? And that's the frame in America, right? Like we have civil rights. There was a civil rights struggle and everything's good now, right? Everything's all good, right? But like that's the frame. That's what we're dealing with,
Wow.
And Martin Luther King said it the best when sort of like he made this address to the SCLC. I guess about a year. It was in the fall. He was killed in April. It was in the fall prior to his assassination, and he was creating the direction of the what would become the Poor People's Campaign that he didn't live to fully articulate. And basically, he was saying we need to move from an era of civil rights that just deals with the surface issues to an era of human rights that deals with root issues.
Right.
And that's what I think people recognize when that woman is like, yeah, I have a human right not to live in this condition because it's about a core value. And that's also how stepping towards the space of transformational relationships and transformational and art that where the interaction that our community engagement, if you will, is trying to aspirationally be transformational because we're dealing with values rather than results or products, right? So it doesn't even matter. It's just about the values, the core values, right? And that's that space of transformation, is identifying what those values are and dealing in that space of values.
And what values, if you could be specific, have emerged through this process in relation to this, this question of human rights and housing?
I mean, I think the value of sort of, the way that the sort of everyday language that kind of articulates housing as a human right is kind of that everyone deserves a home. And then what does that mean? Does everyone deserve like a certain type of space, or does everyone deserve something that's, the principles that we kind of actually came out of the Human Right to Healthcare campaign that kind of, I think, articulate a little bit or start to then dig another way. Yeah, in Vermont, sort of there was the universal healthcare. And so they had different principles that they then used to kind of articulate a little bit deeper the human right to healthcare and what that means, and included sort of equity, participation, transparency, accountability. So that's like one layer, I think, further deep, but it's still a little bit abstract, right?
Oh,
so
it's really abstract.
And so does equity mean that we all get the same thing? Like, no. So, does it mean that maybe everybody gets what they specifically need that fits them, so that an elderly woman has what she needs and a young child has what they need, and so then just like there's the need to continue to articulate those. And I think that's kind of a lot of where we see our work as sort of using the story to articulate what that value of that everyone deserves a home actually means in real terms for people.
Right. Because one of that value is universality, and that everyone should have the universal access to self-determination, whatever that means. But there's something in that universality that these are, like, bar none, afforded to anyone.
My last question, how do you decide who gets interviewed?
It's a great question. Time.
Yeah, I think it's a capacity thing. We did a thing with the new museum as part of their street fest, and like so many people signed up to tell their story, and it was really exciting. And I think the challenge is just capacity. And so we'll partner with organizations, and so try to speak to several of their members to sort of get a diversity of voices from the community if we're partnering with them. Like some of it's time, like we were just in Philadelphia and we wanted to do oral history interviews, and we had a week, so we did 15, and we packed our schedule so that we could talk to as many people, and it was like by the end they were like, no, can you fit in this person, because it was just a matter of time to have that capacity.
Part of the breaking the frame or reorganizing our, I don't know how we're talking about it yet, but it's like talking about these areas of crisis, movement, and vision and dreaming is like, part of that is to clarify how we can focus our outreach to like figuring out that question of who we interview and how we talk about folks and how we diversify the type of story in as so much as the diversity of what people are talking about in terms of like what their aspirations are, you know, like I'd love a story as simple as like someone moving somewhere because of a school district, you know, that type of diversity of stories, like all the different ways that people are trying to construct community within their own life, and trying to like figure out what that is. And that crisis movement vision is like a broad 3,000 feet way we've begun to like hone in on how, as the project moves forward now, we'll think about how we get those stories. You know? Yeah.
And in scope, I mean, I think we've traveled to South Africa. It's the only space outside of the U.S. that we've been, but we really sort of envision a project that would create a collection of stories that really speak to the diversity of this nation, which is a hard thing to say. You know, at some point we would have to cut it off, but you know, the opportunity to really bring in geographic diversity, diversity of stories. I mean, it was interesting in New York, you know, in the couple hundred stories we've done so far, to see the layers, you know, like of just what comes in for people, like whether or not they're in a domestic abuse situation, and so that's a layer of what, you know, how that can cause instability in someone's life, or just, so, I mean, for me, I'm kind of excited by the sort of like open-ended nature of it. I know at some point we'll have to, like, you know, create something to give, you know, but I think
package it.
But I do think at least we see it as a national project that's actually sharing enough stories that we're actually able to articulate in more depth sort of what home means for folks and what we actually need to be considering if we're actually trying to meet the needs of people.
Yeah, and what the common language is. There's a degree of common language that emerges from all these different people, from all these different communities. You know, a glaring hole is indigenous communities that we're trying to figure out how we can spend more time to hear that story, you know, and all of their stories, you know, from that community alone, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of stories.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, and they all got something to say.
Oh,
everybody.
That's what's pretty much interesting. It's like everyone has something to share about home.
Yeah.
Everybody, yeah. And now that we've, like, after we've done so many different stories with so many different folks, like, there's a certain dexterity about being able to get stories out of anybody, right? Because and we find, I don't know if, this is probably, we like, no matter the people that say they have nothing to share are usually the ones that have most to share, right? And it's just like, you know, trying to like just sit with everyone and have the capacity to sit with all the people that we really want to sit with.
Right.
Because everyone has something to say, and they all are evocative storytellers in their own kind of way, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it just reminds me, you know, makes me think a lot about just this notion of democracy and giving voice to everyone in the population, and that attempt, but also the limitations of that as well. And I think that there's something to, you know, having to confront the, you know, the desire to give voice to the you know, arbitrary everyone, but also the limitations of that as well. So you've got your work cut out for you. I say all that to say.
Yeah. For sure.
This project.
Yeah, and this is just one of several projects.
So has this project like spurned other projects, or is this a project unto itself, and then you've got other things happening as well that aren't necessarily related to?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Like, this project has like what we call iterations, and some of the iterations, you know, are full projects, right? And then there's other projects where we're trying to like, figure out what our particular methodology is, you know. And of course it's just, you know, it's constantly changing and evolving. But there's other projects that we've been pitching and trying to figure out how we do that kind of embrace the same methodology to interrogate other questions, you know. There's a long-standing project we're having to do about called Women's Work, which is like, you know, exploring the value, social and economic value of work done by women. You know, what that means, how that work is valued or how what that is constructed through society and mythology and all that stuff. So there's other things.